watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
If we had had this conversation before the unity agreement between Fatah and Hamas was signed, I would have answered it unequivocally yes. And I would presume, in fact, all of the three guests would have. I'm sure they'll tell you otherwise. But in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu said the same thing when he did, in fact, negotiate with President Abbas during the short period of time in which there were negotiations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. And I think it's a fair answer because, in fact, President Abbas has renounced violence. He recognizes Israel's right to exist, and he and his Palestinian Authority incorporate all of the agreements that the Palestinian Authority has previously entered into. Whether you agree with his positions or not is one thing, but clearly I think it is fair to conclude that Abbas and Fatah, as it is represented by Abbas, is in fact a partner for peace. Now, however, there's a very different situation with the unity agreement, and I would answer the question with a question mark. We don't know if there is a partner for peace. And in fact, President Obama essentially said that very same thing when he spoke to the nation on Thursday and then to AIPAC on Sunday morning by issuing the proclamation that, in effect, first things first, the Palestinians, they have the onus to answer the question in terms of, is there a partner for peace? But let's just take it a little bit further and not just to be provocative for provocative's sake, but I'm going to try to be a bit provocative. I think there's also the obligation to ask it with respect to the Israeli side. And yes, of course, Israel is a partner for peace. I don't think there's any legitimate question about that. But is the Israeli government doing all that it reasonably can be expected to do to advance that agenda? And I would argue that I was somewhat bewildered by Prime Minister Netanyahu's response to President Obama's speech on Thursday. And had I been Prime Minister Netanyahu's advisor, which of course I am not, I would have had the Prime Minister make this sort of speech in response to President Obama's speech. I would have come out and I would have said, "Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President, for pointing out to the world what we all should know, and that is that Hamas is a terrorist organization. In fact, just recently, they targeted a school bus. And thank you, Mr. President, for showing the world that the onus is on the Palestinians to define themselves in a way so that they meet the international community's criteria to allow them the privilege of engaging with us in our mutual quest for peace. Thank you, Mr. President, for saying that my nation, the state of Israel, is a Jewish state and the homeland of the Jewish people. Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging that I have extraordinary security concerns on the West Bank, and that no matter what peace agreement may be contemplated, that you understand that any withdrawal of Israeli forces from the West Bank must be phased and not happen until it is demonstrated, until the Palestinians show themselves capable of keeping the peace. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President, for debunking the entire Palestinian strategy of going to the United Nations in September, because you announced to the world that America will have no part of it and that there's no use in pursuing it. So thank you, Mr. President, and I, the Prime Minister of Israel, offer this simple response. I'm ready, willing, and able. I may not completely agree with the President's formulation of the basis upon which to negotiate, but America and Israel stand stronger when we are together, and that's precisely what I, as the Israeli Prime Minister, am going to do. And you know what? When the Prime Minister landed here, he could have had whatever conversation he wished to have with the President in private, and I would respectfully suggest we would have had a very different week. Now, let me close on a more lighter moment. You're probably wondering, why in God's name is this guy Wexler screaming so much? Well, I had the privilege of representing a district. My hometown was Boca Raton in Palm Beach and Broward counties. And in my first race for Congress, I had two extremely worthy opponents that were far more qualified than I was. And the Sun Sentinel, after our first major debate, interviewed the different people in the audience, and one wonderful lady said, I'm voting for a gentleman named Ben Graber because he's a great guy on health care. And another attendee said, I'm voting for Peter Weinstein because he's a consumer advocate and he's great for families and he's terrific for children and so forth. A very wise woman said, I'm voting for Wexler because he's the only one I could hear. And I've never forgotten that.
I'm going to whisper. Now, as I said to the group that was here before, the question is, does Israel have a peace partner? The answer is no. Have a nice dinner. See you later. President Abbas made a decision a few weeks ago. As Bibi Netanyahu put it, he chose peace with Hamas over peace with Israel. Why did he do that? Well, he's ready to leave the stage. He's about 75 years old and says he's not running again next year. So what is he going to leave as his legacy? He didn't want to go into a negotiation where he has to make difficult compromises, where people in Hamas, for example, can call him a traitor because he gave up the rights of the refugees to return to their homes in Haifa. This is not a courageous, charismatic leader. He wants to go home. He wants to go home and live a good, happy life with the money he's made over the years, made a good living. Instead, he wants to leave a different legacy, which is, look, he lost the elections to Hamas, and he lost Gaza to Hamas. So you have this unity agreement, which may be a fraud, we'll see, but he can leave behind this way a unity agreement, and he can say, I inherited a unified Palestinian political system, and that's what I left behind. And I got the UN to vote in September for a Palestinian state, so I've moved the ball forward. Yeah, he's a transitional figure between Arafat and another generation, but he can leave in his terms with his head held high, which is much more interesting to him than getting into a difficult negotiation with Israel that he knows is going to result in tremendous Palestinian turmoil. Now, my friend Bob Wexler and I heard different speeches in the last few days. I heard a speech a few weeks ago, about a week ago. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke to the Knesset. It was a really remarkable speech, because in this speech, he said, Israel needs to have IDF troops on the Jordan River for a long time. And Israel needs to keep the major blocks. Both of those are compromise positions of the sort that had actually led Ariel Sharon to create a new party, the Kadima Party. Because when the Prime Minister says we need to have IDF troops on the Jordan River for a long time, he is saying we don't need to have settlements on the Jordan River, and we don't need to have IDF troops on the Jordan River permanently. When he says we're keeping all the major blocks, he's saying, as for the rest, as for what's beyond the fence, this is not a demand he's making. He made that speech about a week ago. I'd like to know, where was the speech by the President of the United States saying, "Thank you, Bibi"? Actually, the official reaction by the United States was silence. There's no doubt blame to go around for the way this visit was not the ideal visit that we all would have liked to see. But I don't quite, frankly, now that the President's two speeches are over, I don't understand fully what he was getting at, and I can sum it up in two sentences. I'll read you two sentences from the speech, exactly about the question of a peace partner. The President said, "We know that peace demands a partner, which is why I said that Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with Palestinians who do not recognize its right to exist. But the march to isolate Israel internationally will continue to gain momentum in the absence of a credible peace process and alternative." So Israel cannot be expected to negotiate peace except that it has to negotiate. I don't get it. I think it's frankly incoherent. I don't know what the Israelis are supposed to make from those two sentences. Yes or no? I'll just close by asking the question, okay, so now what? And we'll have a chance in the Q&A period, no doubt, to talk about that more. But I think there are two things we should be doing now. One, there will, unless this Palestinian fake unity thing breaks down quickly, they're heading for elections. It would be a very good thing for Israel and for the United States and for peace if Hamas lost those elections. I don't know how much we can do directly, but certainly there are other countries, European countries maybe, certainly the Arab countries, that can help defeat Hamas, help hire fancy consultants, help pay for election campaigns. That would be a very useful thing to do to get the Palestinians to the stage where Hamas is defeated in the election. The second thing we need to do is to remember that many, not all, but many Arabs, including Palestinians, dream of defeating Israel still, dream of setting Israel back, dream of this business of the right of return of refugees to Israel, not to Palestine. We need to make it crystal clear that the United States is opposed to a return to the 67 borders, which are not borders, they're the 49 armistice lines. We need to make it crystal clear that there's no right of return. And the President said in his speech on Sunday that his remarks the previous week, 3 days before, had clearly implied that. Don't imply it, say it! No right of return. The reason I say that is that I think that what the Arabs will listen to, what they will care about most, is a clear understanding of the commitment of the United States from one president to another, from one party to another, in the executive branch, in the legislative branch. They have to know this dream that so many of them have of defeating Israel is impossible because the United States stands with Israel now and forever. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I usually begin by explaining my accent, which some of you get shocked by. So very briefly, I was born in Paris. My father from Morocco, my mother from Uzbekistan. I grew up in Australia by accident, which is basically... The other thing I should mention, as Melvin mentioned, I spent 4 years at the UN. I'm one of the endangered species that has been in the negotiating room for hundreds of hours. You cannot ask me an annoying enough question that would reach that level. So please, as I'm as I'm talking, you have to think, what question am I going to stump this guy with? And even though they're my good friends, I'd also like you to think about the same thing for Robert and Elliott. I'm going to leave it to Rob and Elliott to pass President Obama's speech. My own view is that no presidential speech, no degree of international gymnastics, Security Council resolutions, quartet statements is a substitute for two leaders who want to make a deal and have the skill to do so. What I think we are facing, and what I don't think has been fully appreciated, is that if for the last 20 years we have been either negotiating or arguing about who's to blame for not negotiating, that paradigm of negotiation is about to come to an end. For different reasons, I'll mention a couple of them, the Palestinian Authority is abandoning the negotiating option. The first reason for that, you're not going to like it, I make it my business to annoy an audience I speak to a little bit, they do not see in Israel a negotiating partner. We can like that, we can not like it. We can convince ourselves how much we are. We have not convinced them. They may not be able to be convinced. Second, I won't go into it, but Elliott mentioned Abu Mazen is leaving the scene. He may have wanted to go down as a peacemaker with an agreement he could sell his people. Perhaps he didn't. He concluded that he couldn't do that, and he's better off leaving with a symbolic UN vote, a sham agreement with Hamas, and some kind of transition to elections. And the third reason, which wasn't mentioned, I think has to do with what's happening in the Arab world. There is real popular uprising in the Arab world, and I think the Palestinian leadership, both Fatah and Hamas, are seriously concerned that they better quickly channel any possible Palestinian uprising in Israel's direction, lest it be channeled against them. Everything that's happening, in my opinion, September at the UN, a real increasing chance of violence, the Hamas-Fatah agreement, which is not a reconciliation agreement, in my opinion, it is an agreement to have elections. It needs to be understood in that way, and that creates opportunities and threats as well. All those things are symptoms of a fundamental decision that negotiations are not the way forward, at least at the moment. And then the question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do about it? Now, as an Israeli speaker, I've often found myself in many audiences, Boca Raton being one of them, speaking loudly about, being expected to speak loudly about the threats Israel faces. And essentially, if you get yourself a panel, you may have been one on here, with a bunch of Israeli speakers, there's a competition going on as to who can show you how bad the situation is, right? Who can be more pessimistic than the other. Now, this is not to say that the crises we face are not real. They are very real, and we diminish them at our peril. But I want to suggest to you today that our preoccupation with crisis is itself a kind of crisis. We spend far too much time broadcasting anxiety about the precariousness of our homeland. Now, I have had, very fortunately, the privilege of never having to deal with public relations, Israeli public relations. There's only one kind of public relations that I have dealt with in my career, and that is our public relations to our enemies. In other words, what does Nasrallah think of Israel? What does Khamenei think of Israel? What does Khalid Mashal think of Israel? And I think we may do ourselves no service by broadcasting to them how concerned we are about our future. We have every reason to be confident in our ability to confront the threats we face, and even more reason to broadcast that to the world and especially to our enemies. And I think we use the term existential threat far too much. At the end of the day, leadership is tested not by how well you win arguments, how well you articulate your interests. It's tested by how well you advance them. We are not the biggest shtetl in the world. That means that our responsibility, all of us, as people who care deeply about Israel, doesn't end at identifying the threats we face. I had dinner recently with an Irish Catholic priest And he said to me, what was Jewish about Israel's reaction to what was happening in the Arab world? You're the Jewish state. What is Jewish about your reaction? I thought a minute and I said, well, we're worried, aren't we? And in a way, that obviously wasn't the point. And I think after we ask ourselves, what are we worried about, we need to ask ourselves, what are we going to do about it? Now, I have one rule of thumb. I'm not a very principled person. I don't have lots of big rules about what to do and stuff like that. It doesn't very much help in the dysfunctional environment that I operate in. But there is one that I have. And that is, if you wake up in the morning thinking about how you're going to bring peace to the Middle East, you will not get out of bed. But if you wake up in the morning thinking, how am I going to improve Israel's situation? How am I going to strengthen the objective, which I imagine we all share in this room, to ensure that Israel is a vibrant, secure, Jewish and democratic state, as secure and as at peace with its neighbours as possible? There is lots that we can do. And if there's a thought I want to leave you with, it's the following. A peace agreement is a means, it is not an end. The question we need to ask ourselves is, given the moment that we're in, where frankly a discussion about whether the president said this or that is irrelevant because we're not going back to the table. It's just not happening at the moment. It's not relevant to that issue. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how best at this moment do we advance our interests? Now, the problem we face is that I think for many Israelis, certainly for me, a Palestinian state is a necessity and a threat at the same time. It's a necessity because we need a place that we can point to as the realization of Palestinian self-determination in order to ensure that we have continued support and legitimacy for Jewish self-determination. We may not like that, but that's the dynamic, the international dynamic we're in. But it's a threat because we do not yet know whether we can build a state on our border that will not be a failed state or a terror state. I find the word peace very annoying. That's a great line, wouldn't it? That'd be a good headline to come out of the AIPAC conference. We find peace. We'll put it here on our things. Peace is annoying. The reason why is because it creates connotations in people's minds of a utopia that simply is not on the cards in the Middle East. It's not there. It will not be the Canadian-US border if, I guess that's a peaceful border. It's almost like, when you talk about it, it reminds me of, with Seinfeld, where he couldn't have a girlfriend because her hands were too big, or she left too long a message on the answering machine, or her voice was too loud. Robert, keep that in mind. We as policy people, as people who care about Israel, we operate in the space between what is possible and what is necessary. Right? That's the space we operate. Politicians tend to determine what is possible and then call it necessary. Right? But we don't need to delude ourselves in that way. We operate in that space. And the questions we need to ask ourselves is, how is it possible in an environment where negotiations doesn't seem to be on the table to advance our interests? You should ask me some questions about it because I don't want to take too much time. But I'll say two quick things that I think are critical to it and have about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state that have nothing to do with anybody else. And they are changing the system of government and having a constitution. The last thing I want to say is that at the end of the day, Zionism is about shaping our own reality, not allowing others to shape it for us. That is the heart of Zionism. And Zionism needs to ask not only how do we protect ourselves and how do we create the state that we need, but also how we build the society we want. And answering those questions, rather than engaging in a PowerPoint war and winning the argument in a debate in Cornell, is only about us. It's not about them, not about trusting them or thinking they're good or thinking they're bad or thinking they're partners. It's just about thinking, how are our interests best served at this moment? Thank you very much.
Okay, now we have Q&A, and there are microphones here and there, one on the left side, one on the right side. The location of the microphones is being left and right is not based on political ideology, but you could line up behind the microphones. To get it started, I'm going to toss out a question to the panel. In April of 2004, President George W. Bush and Sharon exchanged correspondence addressing the same issues that are being discussed today. Refugees, it was said, could go only to a Palestinian state, not to Israel. As to borders, they said they had to be defensible and take account of realities on the ground. The essence of that correspondence was incorporated into resolutions in both the Senate and the House, which said basically this is American policy as incorporated in that exchange. The Frist-Daschle resolution, the two leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties in the Senate, and a companion resolutions in the House. And I would like to, I'm puzzled by why the fact that that has been American policy since 2004 has been sort of disregarded in the intervening years. I'd be interested to hear comments from our panel on that.
I would agree with the entire predicate, except I would take respectful exception with the conclusion that, I don't want to incorrectly state your words, but that it somehow is not policy today or that it has been disregarded. There's a difference between not, oh, I'm going to sound like Washington now, and I apologize, but there's a difference between not accepting a particular letter and advancing policies that actually are the same, or I would argue, even more likely to result in an outcome that is more favorable to Israel and to America. Let me be specific. The letter that we reference, and in full disclosure, I voted for, very strongly, supported the effort of the Congress to, in essence, bless the 2004 letter from President Bush to Prime Minister Sharon. And although I don't think he may say so himself, I suspect the gentleman to my right probably had a great hand in writing that letter. The letter was in response to, or in the process of, Prime Minister Sharon unilaterally disengaging from Gaza. And he wanted certain assurances from President Bush, which he received, and I think everyone on this panel will say that was exactly the correct thing to do. And in that letter, President Bush spoke about the 1949 armistice lines and then talked about the fact that the large Israeli population centers should be, in effect, part of the internationally recognized borders of the State of Israel. And Elliott's correct that Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his speech to the Knesset, essentially said the same thing as to the borders and the large settlement blocks. And guess what? Barack Obama said the same thing. The same thing. Barack Obama said that the basis of negotiation, not what I'm imposing, but the basis of negotiation between the Israelis and the Palestinians should be the 1967 lines with, not if, with mutually agreed swaps. Which means, under any rational analysis, that if the Israelis and the Palestinians ever got together in negotiations, it would be our expectation, the American expectation, that roughly 80% or maybe more of the Jewish Israelis who live outside of the 67 lines today would be incorporated into the internationally recognized borders of Israel. Elliott also correctly said that Prime Minister Netanyahu indicated in his speech to the Knesset that Israel needed a presence in the Jordanian Valley, and Elliott rightfully points out he did not use the word permanent. Guess what? Barack Obama allowed for the same thing. He said that Israeli withdrawal from security positions in the West Bank will be phased and in essence will be contingent upon the determination that the Palestinian security efforts are successful. And guess what? Elliott's going to tell me, and he's going to tell me rightfully, that President Bush put it right in the letter regarding the right of return. And he's right. And that's why I voted for it. But guess what? President Obama essentially said the same thing. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a Jewish state of Israel that is the homeland of the Jewish people, there can be no right of return of Palestinians to Israel. They are mutually exclusive results. But we've actually got one or two up on Elliott and President Bush, because President Bush actually didn't talk about a non-militarized Palestinian state. Barack Obama did. President Obama did. And it's good that he did. And there are actually two or three other things that, when you bring it to date, make President Obama's position an exceptionally pro-Israel position and remarkably close to the ideology that Prime Minister Netanyahu expressed to the Knesset a few days ago.
Nah.
May I share a quick story? In my synagogue on Saturday, I was asked to get up and talk about the president's speech. And a gentleman in my synagogue who is an extraordinary attorney in Washington walked up to me after the explanation. He said, this reminded me of my last presentation to the United States Supreme Court. Brilliant advocacy, and I lost the case.
Look, we're all better off if all presidents and all Congresses agree on the support for Israel. I would just make one point here, and that is that that April 14th, 2004 letter, which was in the context of Gaza, as Bob rightly says, said that Israel, all efforts at peace were going to have to recognize the major new settlement blocks. And it never said, and it never implied, on the contrary, it made it sort of ridiculous to say that there had to be a 100% construction freeze in the settlements and in Jerusalem in order to get to a negotiation. That was not the position of the United States. That became the position of the United States. And I'll now cite as my authority Senator Kerry, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, who recently said that the administration wasted a year and a half on what I would call a foolish and impossible demand of a prime minister that there be a 100% construction freeze in Jerusalem. Bob and I have done this at great length, but we only have another 2, 3, 4 hours here, so I'll just stop with that.
Okay, on the left.
Hi, my name's Jacob Magid. I'm from Skokie, Illinois. I really enjoyed this presentation. I just had a question about, I don't really understand the logic behind this unity deal on Abbas's part. They're going to make this presentation to the UN for an independent state. Doesn't this hurt their legitimacy and their public opinion in front of the whole world when they ally with a terrorist organization? I mean, I assume they're trying to do this for their own good, not for our good, but like, I was kind of confused by that idea. Why would they do that?
I'll refer to it briefly. I think it's important to understand the dynamics, first of all. I mean, Abbas certainly was surprised by the timing of Hamas's signing on this deal. Hamas signing on this deal had to do with problems in Syria, in my opinion, certain understandings with the Egyptians and leverage that the Egyptians have on them now, and something that is less said, but a Hamas calculation that, unlike what we would hope, in a year's time with no negotiations, a nice bit of violence going on, and I'm saying ironically, and Fatah officials stabbing each other in the back as to who will run, they have a very good chance of winning those elections. Abbas's calculation, in my mind, and this is something very important when you listen to experts. Experts will tell you about lots of different trends and things going on. One of the most important things I've understood about diplomacy is more important than an international relations degree is a psychology degree. And you need to understand what's going on between a leader's ears. And the decisive factor that made this relevant to Abu Mazen to embrace is the fact that he is resigning. That is the one key issue. Now, does it hurt or help him at the UN? At the end of the day, in the UN, you know, all the Arab states in the UN will vote one way. We know that. All the Jewish states will vote the other way. Yes? And the only real game at the UN in the General Assembly is over the European vote. And that is why there is this pilgrimage at the moment to France, Germany and Britain to see where the Europeans will fall. I think at heart, the Europeans see this deal and the prospect of the Palestinians going to the UN, even with some kind of nominal unity and connection with Gaza, as actually helping the vision of Palestine as a state and coming as some kind of legitimate authority. Perhaps for some of the UN countries it's more of a problem, but I think that some Europeans who became less and less enamored of the Quartet principles as time went on have seen in this essentially a greater argument to support the UN resolution, not to, and that I think is to their detriment and to ours.
Congressman Wexler made the comment that he is certain that Abu Mazen is a partner for peace. I'd like to find out what he bases that on, since he has refused repeatedly to come back to the bargaining table. The Palestinians repeatedly have said they don't have the ability to give up the right of return. And when has Israel ever had a partner for peace? And should that in some way inform how they and how the United States proceed?
I didn't say Abu Mazen was my candidate for the United States Senate from the state of New York. The question is he a partner for peace? He's the president of the Palestinian Authority. And the president of the Palestinian Authority, and what I did say, of course, was up until the time that he signed the unity agreement, so please. As the president of the Palestinian Authority, he has specifically renounced violence, he has recognized Israel's right to exist, and he has incorporated and adopted all of the previous agreements that the Palestinian Authority has, in fact, adopted with the State of Israel. And he has, in fact, participated in negotiations with the State of Israel, and I dare say that Prime Minister Netanyahu, at that moment in time, referred to him as a partner for peace. So, what's controversial about what I said? Okay, me and Bibi are wrong.
I don't disagree with what Bob said. I think the tragedy here is he did change a number of the positions, Abbas changed a number of the positions of Arafat. And if you look at his speech, for example, in June 2003 in Aqaba, he said they would abandon terrorism. He was against terrorism. And he was against it both because it was not beneficial and useful for the interests of the Palestinians, and because it was wrong and immoral. I mean, he said it very clearly. The problem, I think, is, the tragedy is, in that sense, he's a partner for peace. And the problem and the tragedy is, he's a guy who is unable to make the decision to have peace. You needed a courageous Palestinian leader to take tough decisions, and he's not that leader.
I want to add one thing, if I could. I mentioned this to the previous group. I'll mention Abu Mazen and his successor are not members of the Hadassah Women's League of New Jersey. And when you're in the negotiating room, one of the things you have to focus on is not just your own victory speech, but the other side's victory speech as well. And the question, again, we have to ask ourselves is not necessarily, is Abu Mazen a partner for peace or not? Is that, are Israel's interests better advanced by engaging with this leader or not, right? Are we better off being seen as being dead serious about Palestinian self-determination, provided it is not at the expense of Jewish self-determination? And how best do we empower those on the Palestinian side who, while they never will be Zionists and they're not coming to this conference, realize better than their compatriots that the path to realizing Palestinian interests requires coming to terms with Jewish ones? That's the way the case needs to be considered, I think.
Okay. We're now on the left side.
Gary Jacobs from California. I'd like to hear a little bit about the oversight mechanisms for Salam Fayyad's control of the finances in the context of the last couple of days. The Jerusalem Post has an article detailing the price list that the Palestinians pay to prisoners in Israeli jails on terrorism charges, including an extra premium for Israeli Arabs, which constitutes subversive activity, and I think kind of turns Mr. Wexler's assumptions on its head, especially since they actually admitted that those payments go back to the early 1990s.
Whoa, 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 whoa. No, it's a good question. Don't go anywhere. What assumptions do you think that turns?
That they're a partner for peace while providing money to terrorists?
Well, what's your definition of a partner for peace?
Well, I'm afraid we're just not going to have an opportunity for a
I
dialogue.
broke the rules. You're absolutely correct.
Make your
All right.
comment, Bob.
Yes, that's fair.
Okay.
It's an excellent question. When I'm asked, is somebody a partner for peace, it's not, is this an ideal character? Or is this someone I would want to be my friend? Or is this somebody I trust? No. As so many able Israelis have said throughout the years, you don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your enemies. And the question is, before the unity agreement with Hamas, did Abu Mazen position himself in a way in which it is reasonable to engage with him on the core issues of the conflict? And I think it is apparent by the positions that he previously took that that was the case. And the young lady who asked the previous question, and please tell me if I'm mischaracterizing the question, but I think you said, after all, he has not renounced the right of return. Well, the right of return is core to the entire Palestinian narrative. Now, there's nobody in this room, I will presume, that believes there's a right of return for the Palestinians to the state of Israel. But just like I wouldn't expect an Israeli prime minister to give up Jerusalem as an opening act, nor is the president of the Palestinians going to give up the right of return as an opening act. That's the thing you do at the very end when it's crunch time and we get to the point where I think Tal has rightfully said we need two leaders that can make the most crucial, difficult decisions.
I would just add one thing. We've been talking about Abu Mazen, President Abbas. One of the bad results of this Hamas-Fatah deal is that it's probably going to replace Fayyad with another Palestinian prime minister. I have worked with Fayyad for years now. I believe he is an honest man who has driven as best he could corruption out of the Palestinian Authority government. You can look at their budget, it's on the internet. And he has had a constant struggle for every day he's been prime minister against the corrupt Fatah officials all throughout that government. Under him, our, now I guess it's about 5 years program of training Palestinian police has worked. They work hand in glove with the Shin Bet and the IDF against terrorism in the West Bank. When this started, I asked the head of the Shin Bet, is this working? And he said to me, well, you know, what they're doing is they're trying to reduce the level of common crime. You can send your kid out for a quart of milk at 9 o'clock without him or her being robbed, but they're not doing anything about terrorism. I went back 6 or 8 months later and said to the head of the Shin Bet, still true? And he said, no, it's starting. We now have a prime minister in the Palestinian Authority who is actually committed to peace and to decent government. And yes, he says some things that we don't like and we don't agree with, partly because he's a Palestinian, not an Israeli, and partly because he's a politician. But I think that when you look at the Palestinian Authority government, let's say 6 months after he leaves, you'll wish for the good old days.
Tal? Anything, Tal, on this? No? With respect to Salam Fayyad, I would just like to add, with respect to his qualifications, that he has a doctorate from the University of Texas, and any Texan you know is going to be pretty good. Okay, well, take it over there.
Hi, my name is Michelle Pellig. I'm from Los Angeles. I'm a Zionist and a college student. So as a Zionist, as you said, we like to shape our own realities, but as a college student, I'm faced, not so much on my campus, but definitely with my peers, of those who don't see Israel as I hate using this term, but a partner for peace. So I want to know what Israel can do to become more of or be viewed more as a partner for peace, which I see in its strategic interest, while not compromising its democracy or the Jewish nature of the state. And this is directed to you, Dr. Becker.
Okay. I'll tell you one thing in particular that I think about this. When the flotilla incident happened with Turkey, I think we expected every person in this room and every Jew who supports Israel to be armed with talking points and be able to explain why under the law of the sea you're able to board a vessel in the high seas. Now, I'm an international lawyer and I couldn't quote you chapter and verse of the Law of the Sea Convention. In my opinion, making Israel's case, particularly on campus, has a lot less with getting advocates for Israel and a lot more with creating character witnesses for Israel. And it's much more important to show that we are reasonable than it is to show that we are right. What I mean by that is when you talk about Israel, the main objective you're trying to get across to your audience is that Israel is bringing to impossible dilemmas and challenges the same set of values that they share. We just don't live in Texas. We live in a place where, when a vessel comes, we don't know whether it's providing humanitarian assistance or arms for a terrorist group that wants to attack our civilians. And so we're torn between an obligation to our humanitarian obligations to a civilian population and our security obligations to our own population. And there may not be a right answer. But what we're trying to connect with in people who care about, who want to understand Israel better, is with what dilemmas, with what set of values we are confronting the dilemmas we face. Wait for a plane to cross what would be the 67 line plus swaps. We simply could not stop that. So we have to insist on a capacity to intercept planes over a future Palestinian state. If you have another solution, tell me, because it sure ain't nice for a Palestinian state to acknowledge the right of the interception of their airspace from a Jewish fighter pilot. But that's the dilemma we face. And I would challenge anyone who's I would talk to people who are questioning Israel in the way of, this is the dilemma, you tell me how to solve it.
Thank you.
Okay.
For my question, I just wanted to pick up on the comment of the Honorable Wexler about the peace you make with your enemies, not with your friends, which is indeed the mantra of the fringe left in Israel. The mainstream says, yes, you make with your enemies who want to make peace. And unfortunately, the actions of paying terrorists and naming squares under the worst of the suicide bombers and teaching the kids that they will be returning to Israel and they're showing the map where Israel doesn't exist, that's not exactly indication of willingness to make peace. My question is, the title was, do we have a partner for peace? I don't want to come out of this session without knowing the answer. So I'd like to hear from each one of you. I mean, the discussion diverted into different topics. All of them are very important, very relevant. But do we or don't we have a partner for peace? Thank you.
Okay, 3 quick answers. Yes, no, maybe.
And I mean right now. I don't mean...
right now.
We understand the question.
I'll quote the President of the United States. Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with Palestinians who do not recognize its right to exist.
But there was another section.
Amen.
I would say something slightly different, which is I think all of us did answer that question. There is no partner for a negotiated peace agreement at the moment. That doesn't mean that it serves Israel's interests, A, to do nothing, or B, to paint all Palestinians with the same brush. There are areas where interests converge and areas where they divide. And a sophisticated strategy empowers those people on the other side on issues where our interests converge, and disempowers others on areas where our interests differ. It is a much more sophisticated foreign policy than black and white that advances Israel's interests. It does not serve us well to label everyone an enemy in the same way. It just isn't, in my opinion, the best way we advance our security, regardless of who they are.
Okay. Tom Seaton from Berkeley. There's probably several people here who wonder whether the peace process from the beginning has really been a charade due to the right of return question. A victory speech was mentioned. Can any of you envision a situation where a Palestinian leader gives a victory speech in which the right of return is relinquished, and tie that into the response to the leak of the Palestinian papers?
Do you want to take? I'll take it as well. First, the answer is that my colleague David Makovsky says this often. I've stolen it from him, that tough leaders don't talk tough to the other side, they talk tough to their own people. And both our leaders, Israeli and Palestinian, need to talk tough to their own people. And that includes on the issue of return, and I'm sorry to say on our own issues, though we do far exceed the Palestinians in grappling with our own, the decisions we have to make, we still have some work to do. It is also, I mean, we can argue about this, and you'll probably be, I told you I would annoy you sometimes, it is false to think that in the negotiating room, the Palestinian position on refugees has not changed. It has changed. I'm not going to go into detail because I'm not allowed to. But if you read what is out there and you look at the Palestinian position at Camp David, at Taba and at Annapolis, you will see significant differences. That doesn't mean we're close to a deal. And I have to say, I'll go back to this point, but I found that there are three qualities in a leader that are going to be able to make a deal. The first is they have to want a deal. The second is they have to want it enough. Because once they think they want it, they don't quite realize, and you watch this, the kind of learning curve take place, they don't realize what is at stake in actually getting there. And the third thing is they have to have the psychological, emotional, and political skill to navigate the landmines to get to a decision point and confront their people with the reality of what a deal looks like. That is probably the trickiest element we need to find in our leaders, and no, we haven't found them yet.
I would just quickly take Tal's recitation a bit further. What he spoke about in the context of Palestinian leaders is comparable to what has occurred amongst Arab leaders. Arab leaders in Cairo and Riyadh and Rabat, throughout the Gulf and the like. And that is reflected in part in the Arab Peace Initiative for all its imperfections. But the Arab Peace Initiative did not demand a strident Palestinian right of return. It demanded a fair and agreed resolution to the right of return. It's a very subtle but very important difference, because one of the parties that would have to agree, of course, is Israel. And we all know that Israel would never agree to a Palestinian right of return to Israel.
I have a slightly different take on this. Not to really disagree with anybody, but you know, there's been a struggle for, 100 years now among the Palestinians, between the moderates and the extremists. And back in the early days, it was the British who empowered the extremists. Haj Amin al-Husseini, he didn't have to be the Palestinian leader. They made him the Palestinian leader. He was a Nazi. There were moderates among the Palestinian leadership, but they did not have power. My fear is that actually Israel and the United States made the same mistake by bringing Arafat back from exile in Tunis at his lowest point, under the theory that he was a strong guy who could make peace. But I think President Clinton proved that there were no circumstances under which no reasonable ones under which Arafat would make peace. And what happened there was, again, this extremist, this terrorist was empowered. Now, I thought over the last couple of years that a new current was emerging, a much more moderate one, under Fayyad, that said, stop blaming the Israelis. We Palestinians, he said, we need to build a state from the bottom up, which I thought was the right formula. Not as a gift from the Americans, not as a gift from the Israelis. Build institutions from the bottom up. I thought that gave a better promise of ultimately building the conditions, the institutions where you could get a Palestinian state than the negotiating room. But now, for reasons of his own and for many reasons we've talked about, Abbas has gone for a unity agreement with Hamas, which I think, at least for the moment, looks like it's going to end that experiment as well and bring the people who are even more extreme than Arafat right back into the center of Palestinian political life.
My name is Sherry Goldberg, Livingston, New Jersey, and I read on Mr. Abrams' website about a trip that Secretary of State Clinton took to the Knesset, and my question is, how is it that my government, the United States of America, could not identify the Knesset as being in the sovereign state of Israel?
This question is for Mr. Wexler, and I believe you mentioned about 5, 6, maybe 7 times how many thank you cards Mr. Netanyahu should send to Obama. And I'm just wondering, should Mr. Netanyahu send Obama a thank you card for the undiplomatic and insulting way he received him at the White House? And also, should he send him a thank you card for indicating in public that the Israelis should stop building settlements, and which in effect took away the negotiations between the Israelis and the Arabs?
Okay, I think we get the questions. Okay. They're not exactly related, but some quick answers. Go ahead, Elliott, first.
Okay, what the questioner was referring to was a press release the State Department put out last week prior to the Netanyahu visit here. The Deputy Secretary of State went on a trip. And according to the press release of the State Department, he visited Israel, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. 3 separate locations. When you're the Deputy Secretary of State, it's worse than you even think, because what do? You go to government offices. Government offices in the Knesset or the Prime Minister's office or the Foreign Ministry are in West Jerusalem. You're not even going to East Jerusalem. Right. You're not doing any business there. Yet, the State Department couldn't say you went to Israel on the West Bank. For years and years, the United States would say the president or the secretary is visiting Israel and the Palestinian territories, or Israel and the West Bank. So now to come up with a formulation that says the deputy secretary is visiting Israel and Jerusalem is, I think, very unfortunate, to say the least. It's actually unacceptable.
And pending litigation on the issue now pending before the Supreme Court.
And may I add to that, that for years, many of us in the United States Congress, myself included, have voted over and over and over again that when an American is born in Jerusalem, that your passport should say born in the state of Israel. But at least let's be fair. Criticize the Obama administration if you will. President Bush had 8 years to change that. Correct. President Clinton had 8 years before that to change that. President Bush before that, and go down the line, the line, and the line. So let's not point out one administration in terms of the hypocrisy of the others. As to the gentleman's question in terms of thank yous, and now I'm forgetting the essence of it, but the alleged disrespect at the White House,
I'm not certain what you're referring to, if you're referring to the alleged disrespect, if there was, at this meeting or the previous one?
Previous.
Ah, the previous one. Oh, you must not have heard the Israeli Prime Minister to the United States, Michael Oren, very eloquently describe that in fact there was no disrespect. So I didn't see it. The official representative of the Israeli government to the United States said exactly otherwise. You have your view. You're entitled to it. I respect it.
Okay, we got
the settlements. The settlements. Yes. Again, American policy with respect to the so-called settlements in Israel is a policy that was adopted after 1967 and has been consistently applied by every Democratic and Republican administration. And actually, what in effect President Obama said to your conference on Sunday morning was, it's my policy, it's my hope, it's my suggestion for a basis of negotiation to enable those settlements to become the within the internationally recognized borders of the State of Israel. It's as pro an Israel position as an American president could possibly take. It's entirely consistent with President Bush's policy, President Clinton's policy, and the like. If you think American policy should be that we recognize the legality of the settlements, I respect that, but that has never been the policy of the United States of America under any president.
I sense a moment to get a great round of applause for what I'm about to say, so I'm not going to do that. I just want to say one thing. In all of you for sure have experience with negotiations. If you're anything like me, you're a failed negotiator with your children, but you may be good in other areas. And I have seen how often and how easy it is to prove that negotiations fail. To make situations and the context of a negotiation destined to fail. In fact, it's a lot easier to do that than to make negotiations, the conditions for negotiations to succeed. Jerusalem, do you know what the biggest settlement is as far as the Arab world is concerned? Jerusalem. Do you know what is not a settlement as far as Israel is concerned? Jerusalem. You cannot square that circle in the lead up to a negotiation. And if you do it, you won't get to a negotiation.
The panel has said two competing things. One is that there is no present peace partner. It is also said that there have been great improvements on the ground in the so-called West Bank, Yehuda and Shomron, in the area of infrastructure and fighting terrorism and local autonomy. My question, which is a little different from what's discussed here before, is it time to revisit the whole Oslo process and to say that maybe the answer is local autonomy for the Jews in that region to vote in Israel for the national leaders and perhaps to go to the real Palestinian state, which is Jordan, for their national leaders?
The difference between an initiative and a publicity stunt, particularly when it's in the peace area, is that it needs to have the chance of attracting the agreement of the other side. Okay? We can like it or we can not like it, right? But the option of aiming for Palestinian autonomy arrangements is not going to get Palestinian agreement, first. Second, and this is a view I feel very strongly about, you may disagree. Do you know what Israel's security border is on its western side? It is not the Jordan River. It is the external borders of Jordan. It's on the eastern side, I'm sorry. Jordan's borders, on the external borders of Jordan, are Israel's security border. They are our strategic depth. We have a vital interest in the stability of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. If the popular uprisings of the Arab Spring or Autumn or Fall reach Jordan, we're at DEFCON 5. I think that's the term. And one of the reasons why a Palestinian state that is not a threat to Israel, I mean, as much as possible, again, it's a relative concept, is because one of the best contributions to the stability of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and therefore Israel's external security border preventing Iranian infiltration, is the existence of a place where the Palestinians say self-determination in the West Bank, yes, not in Jordan and not in Israel. And so it ends up being that with all the dangers of a Palestinian state, there are real security advantages. You can make a failed peace, and you can fail to make peace. But there is an option that I wouldn't call peace, because remember I said it was annoying, but that simply advances Israel's interests. And that involves the stability of the Hashemite Kingdom.
I agree with what Tal said. I would only add that in answer to the question, I do think that if there ever were a Palestinian state in the West Bank, logic suggests that over time, for economic reasons, for security reasons, for political reasons, it needs to be in some kind of association with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The best dream is probably one king, two prime ministers, a kind of Habsburg, Austria-Hungary style, because the Jordanian security forces work very closely with the Israeli forces. It's not an accident that I think one time in 5 years somebody was able to cross the Jordan River to commit an act of terrorism in Israel. It's not an accident. Nobody crossed those bridges on the recent Nakba Day. So a Palestinian state that is in a close security relationship with Jordan, a close political and economic relationship with Jordan, an economic union with Jordan, patrolled by Jordanian security forces, I think is probably the best outcome from the point of view of Israeli security.
Okay. I want to thank all of the audience. You've been a great audience, and I think we want to thank the panel, which has been superb.